Board.
I didn't even have to remind you, Pete.
I'm recording this session now. Very good. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Peter Smallage, as I've said a few minutes ago. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, host of the Forest Connect webinar series, which is one of the activities of Forest Connect. And I'm pleased to be joined today by a longtime friend and colleague, Dave Apsley. Dave and I went to Purdue University together back in the 80s. Dave was my TA for dendrology. So everything I know about tree identification, I can attribute to Dave. Dave and I have worked together on other things in the past, and Dave stepped forward when I was looking for speakers, and he offered to talk about oak forest regeneration. So it is my great pleasure, yes, lots of other Boilermakers out there, my great pleasure to introduce Dave. And Dave, I'm going to mute my microphone, and it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks, Pete. It's great to be with you today. And I've kind of retitled this presentation today, The Future of Oak is in Your Hands. So let me just check the chat windows. Everybody hearing me okay? Good. Now, if we can get this PowerPoint to advance. So we're going to try something a little bit different today for a couple points during the webinar. So if you have a smartphone and you want to participate, you can go to your text message feature, and by the 2 where you'd normally put the phone number, you're going to enter this number, 37607, and then just text David Apsley 105, all one word, and send that. And that'll have you join the poll. So if you want to do that, it's limited to about 25 responses, but I think it'd be interesting. It'll help kind of guide me as the presentation goes along. So again, go to your text feature on your phone, and for a phone number, just put the 37607 and then text David Apsley 105 to that. And if this is working, we should start seeing some responses to this question. So I just threw this one up to see if it's working. So if you're at that point, again, text David Apsley 105 to 37607, and once you do that, then you should just be able to enter a response. So how are you doing today? I've got somebody that's feeling pretty groovy, so that's interesting. So let's just make sure we get a few other responses, and then we're making sure that works. And then we won't use this for a while, but I just wanted to give it a test run. So good, we can see that that's working. So just to give you a little context, I'm joining you from Jackson, Ohio, and unless you're from the great state of Ohio, you probably have no clue where Jackson, Ohio is. We're down in the southeastern part of the state. It's in one of our Appalachian counties. The area highlighted in yellow is kind of the heart of the Appalachian area, but the Appalachian area in Ohio extends up to the northeast a bit too. We actually have about 30 Appalachian counties, and we're surrounded by forest in this part of the region. The bulk of Ohio's forest is in this 30, or about a third of the land area. So it's down here in the hill country. This is the unglaciated portion of Ohio, and this is where our forests are, and they're predominantly oak. And as with most of the eastern United States, for Ohio, forest ownership is primarily owned, or the forests in Ohio are primarily owned by family forest owners, people like many of you on the webinar today. We're about 72% owned by individual family forests, and then another 14% by other private, which could include industry and so forth. So for today, the topics I'm going to address, I'm going to spend a bit of time up front talking about oaks and why they're important, and talk a bit about our decline in our oak forests. I'm going to talk some about oak ecology, the natural process of oak regeneration, and then how to manage young oak forests after regeneration. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with an initiative we've got going in Ohio called it's the Joint Chiefs Initiative, but we're looking at oak restoration across property lines, and I'll give you a little bit of an idea what's going on there as well. So why do we care about oaks? I have to admit I'm borrowing this from Dan Yalsey. Dan Yalsey's retired from the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station in Delaware, Ohio, And I saw him give a presentation that had a lot of this information in it. And he actually borrowed it from a keynote address that was given by David William Smith at a fire conference in Ohio. And I actually had the pleasure of observing that as well. First of all, I don't know if many of you knew, but the oak tree is the symbol of America's forest. It has stature among all tree species, and it actually is our national tree, and that was passed by legislation in 2004. Culturally, it's got a interesting history. It's a symbol of strength and endurance, and there are lots of examples out there in basically in the advertising world, but if any of you are in the military, you recognize this symbol. And then I can never resist using this quote. It's one of my favorites, that the mighty oak was once a nut like I am. So I'm appreciative of that, and there is a bit of hope. So aesthetically, they add a lot of color, contrast, shape to the landscape. The image you're looking at is an oak that's in Logan, Ohio, just north of where I am. It's about a 7-foot diameter oak in an old cemetery there. One of my favorite trees in Ohio. They've been around a long time. They're connected. Oak has been on this landscape for a long time, and there's lots of records, including carbon records, charcoal records, that show that oak has been around a long time. It's been removed, it's been replaced, and it's been returned. And oak really influences the whole ecosystem in this part of the world. It does have an effect on the fire regime. It has an effect on wildlife. It has an effect on the understory. It really influences the whole ecosystem. It's pretty widespread. There are at least 31 species of oak in the eastern United States. So when I talk about oak in general, there's a lot of variability. At least one oak species is adapted to just about every site in the east. And in Ohio, we have at least 15 species of oak. Here's just a map of the forest types in the east and the role that oak plays. If you get a little bit further south than we are in Ohio, you're going to run into some oak pine forest as well. This is a map, an older map of the forest types of Ohio, but you can see oak dominates the forest in southeast Ohio. And I apologize, I've been fighting a cold today, so you have to bear with me if I'm sniffing and so on today. And then this is a graph I put together for a presentation a while back that just demonstrates from the wettest of sites, if you're standing in a swamp in Ohio, you're likely to run into swamp white oak and pin oak, to the very driest ridges in the southern part of the state where you can run into chestnut oak, scarlet oak, blackjack oak, and so on. So there's an oak that grows on about every site in Ohio. I see in the chat box about, will you be able to get this presentation? I will talk about that later. Oak is also important for wood quality. In southern Ohio, there are quite a few sawmills, and most of them are highly dependent on oak. Oak wood is strong and durable. The white oak wood especially is rot resistant. It's great for fuel. And if you look at the picture in the bottom lower left corner, that's Speyside Bourbon Cooperage, and it just opened here in Jackson, Ohio, producing bourbon barrels. So we're excited about that. That factory has been vacant for several years, and they just moved in and started production in 2016. Oops. And just think about the different uses of oak, from flooring to furniture to cabinets, all the way down to the lower value products like pallets and railroad ties. For wildlife habitat, oaks are essential. Acorns are key for many species. Many species almost totally depend on acorns, especially in the winter months, for food sources. Oaks provide a lot of variation, or a lot of attributes for habitat. It even mentions amphibians and reptiles. There's a study at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest, just about a half an hour from here, looking at vernal pools and the importance of oak leaf litter in the development of amphibians. There's some evidence to show that amphibians don't do as well if those pools are populated with litter from maple as they do if they're populated from litter from oaks. So that's just one thing, we're learning every day about the importance of oak. I've also, on that blog site Pete mentioned in the chat, put some references, and this is a great reference if you want to learn about oak. The whole function of oak in the ecosystem and the importance for wildlife. There are more than 90 wildlife species in North America that use acorns. Everything from bears to songbirds. In fact, black bears in the eastern United States, acorns are a big part of the diet. Without hard mast, it'd be tough for a lot of our wildlife species that overwinter. If you think about food sources and what's available in those winter months and what stores well, acorns kind of fit that bill. Oaks also play an important role for things like songbirds, even neotropical migratory birds that aren't around when the acorn production or when the acorns hit the ground depend heavily on oaks because the insects that they feed on are more prevalent on oaks, and they also, especially the white oaks, are better sites for nesting as well. And then, of course, oaks are dependent on wildlife. Lots of wildlife species are important in moving oaks. Picture the blue jays and the pine in the background. I like to put that in because we kind of joke about how do you get oak back on an old field site, and sometimes the answer may be to plant pine. It seems like they can help ameliorate a site, and then blue jays and squirrels help to get the acorns there. And it's not uncommon to clear cut a pine stand and end up with oak regeneration because of the acorns that were put there by blue jays mainly. Oaks are also long-lived and they provide some stability. Here's just some examples of the lifespans of oaks, and you'll notice the white oak group are the ones that tend to hang around a little bit longer. A white oak can live for several hundred years. Here's an example, actually from my property in Jackson, Ohio. If you look at that old fuzzy photo on the left, that's a black and white photo of my property from 1951. And that little circle represents an oak tree that you'll see on the right that's still there today. And if you look at that site, there's a lot of bare ground. There are a few scattered large trees. And that's probably the effect of grazing and livestock on the property. There's lots of evidence of that. And you'll notice that white oak tree survived all that abusive agriculture. And it still stands there today. It's probably about 40 inches in diameter and 80, 90 feet in height. So they definitely add some stability and help bridge that gap between that heavy disturbance and the forest today. And then finally, oak is kind of an endangered ecosystem. There's evidence to show that at the current trends, oak forests are in danger, and we're in danger of losing a big chunk of this oak forest in a relatively short period of time. And largely because we caused the problem. So we need to work on this problem, and we'll talk about that as we progress through the presentation. It's a little awkward to do a webinar when you don't get any feedback from the audience. So if folks want to chat once in a while just to let me know you're still out there, that'd be great. So oak forest in decline. I want to talk about that a little bit. Oaks have been here a long time. They're here now, but will they be here in the future? And why are we worried about this? Well, this is Ohio, and if you look, this is where we currently are. We're heavily dominated by oak forests, especially in the southern part of the state. Probably about 60% of our forest canopy is dominated by oak. But if you look in the understory and you look at the young forest, we're not seeing the oak regeneration. Here's some evidence of that. These are the diameter distribution. If you look on the left, it's 2-inch diameter class all the way up to 29-inch plus. And you'll notice that over here on the right, in these large size classes, oaks dominate. They make up about 50% of the canopy, even though we've got dozens of hardwood species, tree species that can be in the canopy. Oaks make up about half of that, even on some of our most moist sites. On the drier sites, they may make up a higher percentage. But if you look down here and what's regenerating in our forest, fewer than 5% of our regeneration is oak. It's being dominated by mainly things like red and sugar maple. Here's just another way to depict it, and the biggest competitor are the maples. You'll notice that oak again is still up here, highest percentage in the large classes, but down here it's dominated largely by maples. And then another graphic representation, the total volume of wood out there. Look how that's changed dramatically in the past 40 years. Better make it 50. I was wishing it was 40. I was born in 63. But you can see oak dominance is really dropping, and the maples are basically a mirror image of that. Oops. So, first question to get some feedback and give me a little break to hydrate a little bit is, what do you think the biggest obstacle to oak regeneration is? So go ahead and text. You don't have to enter that again if you've already done it. If you haven't done it, go to the number 37607 and do David Apsley 105. And once you've joined, then you just text your answer. And I like to see that. If you're putting a two-word answer, go ahead and hyphenate that answer so it all appears together. Hey, Pete, it's working. We weren't sure if it'd work or not, but we thought we'd give this a chance. And I see there's still answers coming in. I think we're limited to 25, so we'll give it a second here and see what folks are saying. So I can almost guess a bit about where folks are coming from by the answers here, and we'll move on. But if you notice, deer is the #1 answer. So I'm guessing that a lot of you folks are from the eastern part of the United States, probably from Pete's state of New York and maybe Pennsylvania. And in those areas, deer are definitely a big problem. It keeps moving around. Let's see what we've got here. We've got shade and lack of fire, disturbance, habitat loss, invasive species, altered fire regimes, development, invasive species. So there are lots of reasons, and we'll talk about all of these. And we probably won't focus as much on deer as some of you might think, but we'll talk about that and address that and how it's an issue in Ohio. So why the decline? Oaks gain a competitive advantage from disturbance. And historically, especially prior to European settlement, fire was that disturbance. We've also added a lot of unnatural disturbance. If you look at that photo I showed earlier, the old 1951 photo, livestock grazing was an important part as well, and probably some other disturbances, some severe, even some of the severe agriculture that really depleted some of the soils around here may have very well favored oak. In many cases, the more severe and the more frequent the disturbance, the more oak is favored. And many of our forests established during or shortly after these high levels of disturbance. So right after agriculture was at its heaviest and after the Great Depression, then a lot of our forests in Ohio, in fact, 2/3 of our forests that we have today were not here in the early 1900s, that have reestablished since then, and many of them responded to that disturbance with oak. The type, frequency, and severity of disturbance has changed. Fire is almost gone in our landscape here in Ohio. It can occur occasionally, but usually not very severe. Livestock grazing and other man-caused disturbances have also decreased. And then our timber harvesting practices have really changed. We shifted more towards removing individual trees from the canopy instead of doing clear cutting or more severe disturbance. And these timber harvests that we do often target our dominant oaks. So we're shifting composition by favoring or by removing more oaks than other species in the canopy. So that also is reducing the potential for seed production and so on in the future. And then these harvests don't allow adequate light to reach the forest floor. So a little bit about oak ecology. Oak has many fire adaptations. Mature oaks typically have relatively thick bark. Oaks have the ability that if they're wounded from fire or other damage, that they can compartmentalize or wall off that damage to prevent decay. White oaks are especially good at that. Seedlings develop relatively large root systems, and their buds, they have a series of buds that are hidden right below the soil surface. And then oak leaves are really designed to burn. If you've walked in an oak forest, if you're a hunter and you try to hunt an oak forest squirrel hunt or even get to your tree stand to deer hunt, you'll notice those leaves are crunchy. They kind of curl up. They have structure that they don't break down too quickly. And in the spring, when we have most of our wildfires, they're actually designed to burn. The regeneration strategy is really interesting. They have cyclic crops. So depending on the oak species, some years you have these big bumper crops of acorns, and then you might have several years before you have the next crop. And typically, and you'll see this with white oak especially, you get these large pulses of oak regeneration. You walk in the forest and you see all these little oak seedlings that have just germinated, and you'll think, gosh, this is going to be great. And if they have adequate resources, there's enough light getting to the forest floor, these oak seedlings will invest quite a bit of energy in developing large root systems. In proportion to the top, the root system is very large. And then following another disturbance, another fire or grazing or whatever, if the right conditions are there, they'll have some rapid top growth. And that's kind of the strategy. But if you get that large pulse of regeneration and they don't get the resources they need, they're pretty short-lived. Here's an example. This is Todd Hutchinson. He's one of the lead researchers at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest in Vinton County, Ohio. Believe it or not, if you're not from Ohio, Vinton County is 80% forest. And if you'll notice in Todd's left hand, he's got an oak seedling. In his right hand, he's got a little maple seedling. And we'll show you another image to show you the contrast and the difference between oak and red maple seedlings. If you'll notice that big carrot root. So with fire, oak has a lot of energy stored in that root system. And when we have a spring wildfire, a lot of times our oak will get top killed, but all that energy reserve is in that root system. With red maple, there's not near the root system. And the time of year when we have our spring fires, usually around the first week in April, the maples have put a lot of their energy up into the canopy. So that energy is up in the canopy, the sap's above the root system, and then a fire comes and basically disconnects that energy source from the root system. And so a fire, especially repeated fires, will kill red maple pretty quickly, where red oak has this, or the black oaks and the other oaks have this ability to resprout. So when it comes to oak regeneration, this publication, and again, I've got the reference on my blog site we'll share with you in a little bit, but this is the basis for Silva Oak, which is basically a series of prescriptions for managing oaks in the mid-Atlantic region. And there's been some adaptations for the Appalachian Plateau region, which includes Ohio as well. This is a publication by the Northern Research Station. A lot of folks that come over here and help us do our oak Silva training, including Pat Brose and Susan Stout and Gary Miller and the late Kurt Gottschalk are heavily involved with this publication. So from this publication and from some other sources, there's some real cardinal rules to successful oak regeneration. First of all, you've got to have competitive oak regeneration in advance of removing the canopy. If you don't, your chances of success are very, very slim. And this advanced regeneration has to be released in a timely manner. If that regeneration develops in the understory, has that large root system, and it's not released, it's ephemeral and it eventually goes away as well. It needs light to be able to maintain itself. So typically the best conditions for oak regeneration are intermediate light, not heavy light, not real, not totally open conditions and not totally shaded conditions. And you have to be competitive, this oak regeneration has to be fairly large. Some of the old publications, Ivan Sander back in the, I think in the 70s, they talked about 4.5 feet height as the kind of the cutoff for successful oak regeneration. But more recently, they're looking more at the root collar diameter, which gives you an indication of how much root mass is under there and able to respond. And then again, it must be released. Some other things to think about: regenerating oaks is more difficult as site quality improves. On drier sites, it's a lot easier to regenerate oak. And it takes lots and lots of seedlings, the small seedlings, to get larger advanced regeneration. The percentage of seedlings that make it is very low. So you need just high numbers. And then finally, one of the big keys to moving these seedlings into that advanced regeneration is controlling the understory shade and protecting from deer browsing. And this will vary a bit depending on where you're from. So here's that oak regeneration window. Just explain this graph a little bit. This is totally open. This would be what it would be like in a clear cut. Down here we've got closed canopy. That's under the shade of a forest. And in the middle is this partial light. And in a moist forest, we've got a very narrow window. Conditions have to be just about perfect to get oak regeneration. But as you move to a drier site, the window gets much larger and it's much easier to regenerate oak. So before we move on and talk about deer, all you have to do now, if you've been in this poll, is just answer the question. Just text me an A, B, C, or D as to how big of an impact do deer have on oak regeneration in your area. So let's see if people are still alive out there. Good. We've got some responses coming in. And again, I'm going to take just a little break while some of these come in. Okay, Pete, it looks like we have an audience from the East a little bit more than Ohio. And those numbers are changing a bit, but deer impacts vary considerably. In Ohio, we're in this probably, a lot of these bee people are from Ohio. We're actually in an area where deer don't have a huge impact on our oak regeneration. And they're probably not the most limiting factor for oak regeneration in Ohio. This is actually data from a study that I was involved with and still have deer exposures out. I've got 36 deer exposures in southern Ohio in fenced, and we've got paired unfenced areas. And these are in a variety of sites, but they're in sites that have been where the canopy was partially harvested. We're also in sites that have had prescribed burns, repeated prescribed burns at 5-year intervals. And then they're in sites that have had both canopy removal and repeated fire. And then finally in control areas where there's been no treatment activities. And you can see in Ohio, this is across all species. Frankly, we didn't have enough oak regen when we started this study to see what the impacts were on, deer impacts were on oak. But you can see deer definitely decreased the height by a slight bit, but it's barely significant in Ohio. Deer do consume acorns, and that's one of the things we looked at. We showed that in these fenced areas that there were 2.5 times as many acorns left, not only in the fall shortly after the acorns hit the ground, but also in late winter, in the first part of March even. There were 2.5 times as many acorns left in the fenced areas as outside the fenced areas. So deer definitely have an impact there. And then they browse regeneration. The one place we did see some damage was adjacent to one of our state parks where there wasn't much deer hunting. I don't even know if it was allowed at that time in the early 2000s. And right adjacent to that park, there was definitely evidence of deer browsing on especially oak sprouts. But in other states, deer are often a problem. And at low densities, aggressive hunting targeted at female deer may help. There's some evidence from some studies down in the southeast that show if you're really good and you're really intent on harvesting does, and you do it over a period of time, that you can significantly decrease deer pressure, and it takes a bit of time for those deer to come back into the area. But if you're in high density areas like much of Pennsylvania and New York, at least historically were, I think things are greatly improving in that part of the world as far as deer populations. Fencing may be the only option. And again, fencing will eliminate the deer as the obstacle, but it won't eliminate the other things. So you not only got to combine deer management, but you still have to do everything else that we're talking about to get the oak regeneration to have any chance. I have a question on, do squirrels have an impact on regeneration? Again, squirrels do impact. They consume acorns, but most of the regeneration occurs after these bumper crops of acorns. So those bumper crop years, there's usually enough acorns that make it to the ground, that germinate, that create that population or that cohort of seedlings. During low acorn years, most of the acorns are consumed and very little of them make it to regeneration. So in a nutshell, some things to know about silviculture and regenerating oak. Cut and pray doesn't work very often. You just don't have much of a chance to make it work if you don't really work at it. You've got to manage these cohorts of new oak seedlings, and those usually occur after really good acorn crops. And it's best to start managing before the acorn crop in preparation for it, and after the acorn crop as well. And what we want to do is try to improve the competitiveness of these seedlings. And mainly we're looking at a couple things. Mid-story removal. In Ohio, even with our oak-dominated forests, the mid-story is often maple. In southern Ohio, it's probably more red maple, and as you work your way to the north, it's more sugar maple. But if you know much about maple, it casts very heavy shade and it doesn't allow much light to come through. And we get these multiple layers of maple in there that almost completely block sunlight to the canopy. And then some partial removal of the overstory can also help. But it's usually good to delay that partial removal until after you've done the mid-story removal and you start getting these seedlings to develop. And then once you get oaks that are competitive, that have that large root collar diameter, that are say 3/4 inch in diameter right there at the ground line, that's when you remove the overstory and allow the oak to regenerate. So next question, what's the most common type of timber harvest in your area? And again, if you have a 2-word response, go ahead and put a hyphen between those 2 words. Okay, it looks like a lot of people, the size of the word indicates the number of times that it's been entered. So you can see high grade seems to be the most common answer. Single tree selection or single tree removal, and selection or selective cuts seem to be right up there. And so if we're talking about those types of harvests, we're not doing much to allow sunlight into the forest floor. And if we do disturb the canopy by removing individual trees, we're not getting enough light to the forest floor to last for a long time. Okay, again, so high grade seems to be the answer. I see very few. I do see clear cut in there. It's not an answer that comes up. It's over here too. It's spelled a little differently both times. But again, shelterwood's the one we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a bit about some other types of harvest here, but that gives me some good ideas of where you folks are coming from. So in order to talk about light, it's good to understand shade tolerance a little bit. And by intolerant, intermediate, and tolerant, we're talking about a tree's or a species' ability to survive in shade and grow in shade. And the species on the left are those that do not tolerate, they do not do well under shaded conditions, and they need full sunlight to be able to survive. Without full sunlight, they don't make it very long at all. And so those species like yellow poplar, black locust, cottonwood, and so on will regenerate typically very well following a clear cut where you have full light exposure. Seedlings can grow very rapidly when given enough sunlight. On the opposite end of the spectrum, over on the right, you've got the species that I mentioned, the sugar maple, the red maple. Those species can actually survive and continue to grow fairly well in low light conditions. In fact, as low as a couple % full sunlight. So those species like sugar maple, the strategy is seeds hit the ground, the seedlings just slowly grow and gain in stature, and then when the canopy goes away, they're there to take over. And then if you look at where the oaks typically occur, they're somewhere in the middle. So if you plant an oak, an acorn out in an open area at a clear cut, or it's there to begin with, it's not going to compete well with yellow poplar initially. Yellow poplar is going to outgrow it under full sun conditions almost every time. On the other end of the spectrum, in the shaded conditions, they might survive a while, but they're eventually going to die and not survive. I saw where patch cuts are gaining, and I think patch cuts or group selection cuts are another possible solution to some of this problem. So keep in mind when I talk about some of the harvest, I'll try to remember to mention group selection as another alternative. So single tree selection harvest. Many of our high grades are going to favor their shade tolerance, and shelter woods can favor oaks. And that's kind of the technique that we recommend. Group selections could work similar to a shelter wood, especially along those edges. But in the center of those groups, it's probably going to be more like a clear cut. And on the very edges and into the surrounding areas, it's going to be more like a partial or a single tree selection. But shelter woods really don't work well unless that interfering vegetation is reduced. And fire is the tool that we've been looking at a lot in Ohio. These pictures are from some studies in southern Ohio at a couple of our state forests, Zaleski, the Vinton Furnace, and Tar Hollow, actually 3 different state forests where they spent a lot of time using fire. The state Division of Forestry and the Forest Service are using fire as a tool, and they're having some successes. But there are also other techniques that can work and that we're starting to explore. As many of you know, when I showed the demographics of Ohio and much of the East, it's privately owned. So fire is probably not something that's economical or even available to most private woodland owners. So here's what fire does. If you look at up here in the upper left, that's a site, I believe, at the Vinton Furnace prior to fire. Year 4, after 2 burns, after 3 burns, you can see how it really starts to open up. If fires are intense enough, you'll start losing a few of the canopy trees too, so additional light comes in. And then when that happens, you're going to start seeing oak regeneration occurring. And there's several shots of it here, but the oak seedlings, these little chestnut oak seedlings, tend to start developing a little bit more. After every fire, here's an example. This was probably the main stem of this chestnut oak. After fire, they typically get knocked back, but the sprouts grow even more vigorously. And it's not uncommon to see those sprouts back to or even twice as tall as they were after this, twice as tall as they were before the fire within a growing season after the fire. And here's another example, just oak regeneration everywhere. Yes, there's other things mixed in, but the oak regeneration there is now large enough, has a large enough root system that it can be pretty competitive. Here's a site that looks like a fire went through, but this is a site, and again, Todd Hutchinson from the Forest Service Northern Research Station, starting to do quite a bit of work trying to remove that mid-story with herbicide treatments. These are hack and squirt or injection treatments with Arsenal AC, I believe. And if you look, it looks very similar to the effects of fire. So herbicides are a tool that can be utilized if you're trying to regenerate oak. There are different techniques. These individual stem treatments are what we're working with in Ohio. In other parts of the area, some of the folks that are working with oak silva have actually clipped some of those oak seedlings and done foliar applications of herbicides to other things. There's been mistblowing that's done, but in Ohio, we're looking at injection treatments as the alternative to fire. Here's some examples. Just a year after herbicide treatments, the amount of sunlight that's making it through the forest to the forest floor has greatly increased. It went from 2% full sun, which at 2% full sun, that's American beech, and sugar maple, red maple territory, and that's about all can survive in that low of light. But to just with the understory or mid-story removal to 18% full sunlight. So those are conditions that are going to start favoring oak. And then if you look at this image, this is a shelter wood cut at Vinton Furnace State Forest. These are massively tall oak trees, a lot of white oak. And what's amazing is this is a northern facing slope. And historically, this area probably wouldn't have been an oak, but prior to this shelter wood treatment, it had oak from the very bottoms of these slopes to the very tops. And normally in these lower slope positions, it's almost impossible to regenerate oak. This is a site that has had multiple burns prior to the shelter wood removal, where the canopy is reduced. And then the oak regeneration is really doing well. It's really time on this site to remove that canopy and allow the oak to compete. Doesn't mean it's going to be full 100% oak, but there will definitely be an oak component on this site, and largely due to the fire treatments and the partial canopy removal with the shelter wood. Our wildlifers love these sites. Got the benefits of open areas and the benefits of having tall trees in them as well. For songbirds and so on, we see red-headed woodpeckers in this site almost every time we visit it, but realize this is that with a shelter wood, this is a period of time or a stage that doesn't last for a long period of time. So once we get some oak regeneration, what do we do? Here's an example in a clear cut. So yes, you can get some oak regeneration in a clear cut. This was a 1998 clear cut at the Vinton Furnace State Forest, and I'm working with some of my colleagues at Hocking College and Division of Forestry here in Ohio. It's a demonstration area. It's clear cut again in 1998. We went in 2009, almost 10 years later, and if you look, there were quite a few oaks out there. So you will get oak regeneration in a clear cut. But one thing I've not mentioned is the source of that oak regeneration. And I've mentioned the one source, which is the seed and the seedling production, but oaks also sprout. So many of the oaks in here are probably sprouts, and especially the larger ones. If you'll notice, there were 130 oaks per acre. It seems like a reasonable number. But when you look proportionally to what else is out there, it's a relatively small percentage. And we started looking a little further. On average, they're a little bit smaller, and they're not in very good competitive condition. If you look at this black oak, it's pretty much surrounded by faster growing vegetation. It's getting a little bit of sunlight from above. So we've tried a little experiment, and we're still working on this. In 2011, we did a crop tree release, which is a little earlier than most people have thought about doing crop tree release, although it's becoming more and more apparent that this is probably what needs to happen. And what we're trying to do is those oaks that are in the canopy, preferably the ones that are large and are what we call codominant, which means they're up there even with the canopy, and even ones that we call intermediate, they're just getting a little light from above. We gave them some room to grow. And we're really in the process. We've just gone out and reevaluated and re-released some of these trees. And we're seeing that some of those trees that were released since 2011 have grown 3.5 inches in diameter. So they've doubled in diameter, or more than doubled in diameter. But you can see how much work it took. We had to release or remove 6.3 trees on average to get these oaks with room to grow on all sides. So we're using what we call crop tree release. We're trying to remove all the competitors that are touching the crown of these oaks. And by doing that, we believe we can keep more oak in this forest. We can keep them competitive and keep them for the long haul. So even if you don't go through all the steps, you can salvage some oak. You can keep oak as a component, but you have to manage it. Got a question. Is yellow poplar desirable in Ohio? That's a good question. Yellow poplar, if you're looking at timber management, yellow poplar does have value. Probably per board foot isn't near what oak would be, good quality oak would be, but on a good poplar site, on a moist site, you can grow quite a bit more volume per acre at a faster rate. So for timber production, and for income and for management, on the right site, yellow poplar can be great. For wildlife and some of the other ecological benefits, it's not so great. They don't produce much of a food source for many species. And here in Ohio recently, we've had some major mortality of yellow poplar due to some native insects that have really hit some really high levels. There's a scale insect and a weevil that damaged the foliage, and we've had quite a bit of yellow poplar mortality, and the trees that didn't die have really had a setback in large part of southern Ohio. So to kind of wrap things up, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions. In Ohio, we started an effort. It's Ohio's Collaborative Oak Restoration Effort. And we actually applied, the USDA Forest Service and NRCS applied for a Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Project. And we were funded back in 15. And so they brought in Division of Forestry as a partner. I've been helping with the project as kind of the outreach person, the coordinator to help with our efforts. And we're focusing mainly on these 17 counties in Appalachian, Ohio. This is where our national forest land is. It's the lime green. We've got 3 chunks of national forest in Ohio, all part of the Wayne National. And then these red chunks are our state forest. Our largest one, Scioto Trail State Forest, Zaleski State Forest, and that Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest is located where my arrow is here. The Vinton Furnace, we've had research, collaborative research with the Forest Service going on since 1952. So a lot of the early oak regeneration work was done at least replicated at the Vinton Furnace. So we've got all the partners working together collaboratively to try to work on this oak restoration issue. And here's just some of the things we've been doing. I don't have a lot of the data, but we're looking at forest stand improvement, coordinated treatment of invasive plants, mainly Ailanthus or tree of heaven, prescribed fire, and even feral swine control. We're starting to get some feral swine problems in southern Ohio we're dealing with. We've actually had some EQIP funding in Ohio reserved specifically for forest stand improvement related to oak management, which is a first for us in Ohio. And then we're doing a lot across borders and boundaries to try to get the message out and to mainly make sure we're all on the same page, sharing data, sharing resources so we can figure out which treatments are most effective. And then there's lots of obstacles. I saw Lee Crocker is on here in the chat window, and I didn't give him credit for this photo, so I want to do it verbally. This photo came from Pennsylvania, I believe. Looks like a shelter wood cut. Looks like a savanna. But does anybody want to respond in the chat window? I guess maybe you're not supposed to, I saw. Oh yeah, you are supposed to. What do you think that is in that understory, that grassy regeneration? Does anybody want to venture to guess? Well, we got a lot of people who are used to stiltgrass. Stiltgrass wasn't on our radar screen 20 years ago, but it's becoming an issue. And I think deer are helping to exacerbate that in other areas to the east because deer don't probably consume it and help to spread it. So you can see invasive species can be a real obstacle. I didn't mention them much because invasive species are going to vary depending on where you are. But I think it doesn't hurt to repeat and to just reiterate the importance of managing those invasive species, especially prior to a harvest. Anything that disturbs the canopy or the forest floor, including fire, can really make these invasive species take off. So with that, I'll take questions. I've got a blog site that's listed right here, and I believe Pete's also going to share the posting, but I put this PowerPoint presentation on that site in PDF format, and then I also have references listed of several of the things that, for the things that I've referenced today. So with that, I'll take some questions, Pete.
All right, Dave, great job. I'm typing in the blog website if I want to make sure I do it correctly. USC Ohio Woods. All right, so there's the link. People can click it as a hot link. First of all, Dave, great job.
Thank you.
This was a lot of fun to watch. So this is the chance if people want to type in questions, they should start typing in questions. Several questions and comments came in over the course of the presentation. You hit on some of those. Just so you know, Dave, the text response thing was a wild hit. So
That was fun, wasn't it?
yeah, we'll be trying to do that more in the future. So
Good.
I'll take the host prerogative. I get the first question. In New York, at least, and in some parts, other parts of the East and Mid-Atlantic, American beech is a big problem, partly because we have beech bark disease, which kills the mature trees, stimulates root suckering, and then the deer don't eat it, and so it creates multiple layers of very dense shade. To what extent is beech or a ecologically parallel species problematic in Southeast Ohio?
Beech isn't as big a problem here. And again, I think largely because of the deer differences. So our probably closest parallel species would be red maple.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, since you mentioned beech and controlling some of those understory species, one of the things I didn't mention that might be worth looking at, we just haven't been able to pull it off like you did, and that's possibly looking at goats or some kind of a browsing animal to mimic fire or herbicides as well. But we haven't been able to figure out how to make that happen yet, at least to try it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you want, Dave, how do you want to handle questions? Do you want me to scroll backwards and read them to you, or do you want to scroll backwards and read them?
Either way is fine, Pete.
All right, I'll scroll and then you can and then maybe if people have questions about specific.
Yeah, because you've been watching them all along, so maybe if you look and, see if you've got some that have popped up maybe more frequently.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so and what I'll do is I think I can save this chat window, and so I'll add that either to Dave's blog or I'll copy Dave's blog into my blog. There are several references that people suggest. Tom Ward offers one here, Oak, the Frame of Civilization. So I'm not going to read through those.
Okay.
And just to reiterate the response to the question about having a presentation, Dave has a copy of this on his blog site, which you can see on the screen. And this presentation is being recorded and will be posted soon in the next couple of days to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/forestconnect. Okay. You didn't mention gypsy moth. So gypsy moth historically was an issue. How about currently?
Well, gypsy moth's a little different than Ohio in your part of the world. Gypsy moth came into Ohio in the early 1990s. And I moved to Ohio about that time, and we were all, kind of bracing for it and expecting to happen what happened in Pennsylvania and New York State. And we've had outbreaks of gypsy moth, but we haven't had the damage that you had when it blew through. And I think it's possibly the fact that I think Entomophaga, the fungus that's actually affecting gypsy moth populations, had a chance to develop and take hold before gypsy moth really came to Ohio. So we get some minor outbreaks. Our Ohio Department of Agriculture does gypsy moth treatments, and we've had some examples in northeast Ohio in the early 1990s. We had some stands that were killed by gypsy moth, but in general, it's not a driving factor here. We haven't had mortality on a large scale from gypsy moth.
Okay. How about oak wilt? I mean, that's cropping up. I've seen reports of it from the Lake States, Wisconsin. We have a couple of hot spots in New York. How about is oak wilt part of the Ohio?
It's here. It's spotty. I actually have a spot on my property that, thanks to a utility company bringing it in with some trimming, I have a small spot on the property. But again, it's not widespread. It's not a driving factor. We have had some oak mortality in Ohio, mainly white oaks, and it's happened since about 2000. And they're calling it a decline syndrome. Bob Long, who used to be here in Ohio, is now in, I believe, Warren, Pennsylvania, studied it and found that, especially on these more moist sites that probably historically were not oak sites, we've had quite a bit of mortality. And what's caused it is probably it was initiated by a series of native insects that defoliated and stressed the trees, and then a series of extremely wet conditions, extremely dry conditions. followed up by some fungal pathogens that kind of polished some oaks off. So we've had some white oak decline in mortality, but it's more of a, I think we've got some overly mature trees off-site and a little bit more moist site conditions where those fungal pathogens could polish them off. But those are major forest health issues when it comes to oak over the last few years.
Okay. How about, here's a question about the relationship or maybe the changing relationship of oak and American chestnut. So as you mentioned that in the early 1900s, a high percentage of the forest had been removed. Where was American chestnut in that mix? And in some places I know oak replaced chestnut. Maybe it was different than in Ohio. What?
Ohio, it depends on what part of Ohio you're talking about, but there were parts of Ohio that were probably fairly high levels of American chestnut, more in our east central, right along the Pennsylvania border, and then the further west you probably had a bit less chestnut. I think it's a little debatable how much chestnut was on the landscape. There's certainly evidence at our Event and Furnace State Experimental Forest that it was there and is still there trying to resprout. And I think as far as, filling that void, oaks probably did fill a lot of that void. Oaks, as far as providing food, do a similar thing to chestnut. The big difference between oak and chestnut is that chestnut was probably a much more consistent producer of fruit. So chestnuts flower and start producing flowers and fruiting much earlier than oaks, or much later, I'm sorry, in the growing season. So they had more frequent success as far as producing mast or hard, the chestnuts. And so there's actually some speculation that wildlife populations were quite a bit higher when we had, high levels of chestnut and real frequent, almost annual production of fruit versus oaks are more cyclic. But certainly oaks have filled some of that void, but not total one-for-one replacement, I guess.
Okay. Then there's a question, you were mentioning hack and squirt. Do you have a recommendation that you use? So what do it sounds like you're probably mostly treating maple.
Almost exclusively.
And
maple.
so what's the recommended hack and squirt formulation that you use in Ohio? And I'll just give the caveat that you always read the label and you need to follow your state regulations.
And I'm going by memory, so I'm not going to do it, but they're using Arsenal AC and at the label rate.
Okay.
So
when I saw that, I posted a comment that Dave Jackson, who was on this webinar earlier with Penn State, has done a couple of really good forest herbicide webinars. Those are recorded on youtube.com/Forest Connect channel.
Yep. And Joanne Rabick at the Forest Service has got some stuff out there. I'm pretty sure I know that number, but I hate to even give the number without
that's why I'm always err on the side of caution with that. So how about you showed some pictures of crop tree release. At what point in the development of the oak forest do you initiate crop tree release in terms of either the age of the oak or the size of the oak? And does it matter if you're working in a clear cut versus a shelter wood versus something else?
Excellent question. I'm glad somebody asked that one. It kind of used to be that we talked about doing crop tree release, after full canopy closure and when you could easily get under that forest canopy, and the competition has, thinned it out a little bit. And obviously on a large scale like a state forest or national forest, we can't go into a clear cut a year or two after and start managing seedlings. But on private lands, I highly recommend getting in as soon as possible and doing an inventory, see what you've got. If you're dominated, say after shelter wood, and all your regen is oak, and that's the predominant regen out there, you probably don't need to do much early. But if you're in an area that is, oak or a small percentage of the regen, then anything you can do to manage that oak all along and help keep them into the canopy, the sooner the better. Even when you look at stump sprouts and thinning those sprouts down to a single stem, I don't think you can do it frequently enough. And on private lands, if you're firewood cutters out there, once the material gets large enough to utilize as firewood, you can almost continually release those oak trees. But if you, especially following a clear cut, when you've got a high number of species out there, your probably highest numbers of oak are going to be right after the cut, and they're going to start declining pretty rapidly. So the sooner you can get out there, certainly within that first 10 years, you can have a bigger impact and have a better chance to have a higher percentage of oak out there for the long haul.
I'm assuming if you're in those fairly young stands, young developing stands of a couple of years, a lot of your TSI could be done with, you don't need a chainsaw, you could do it with loppers or even hand pruners, just enough to give those oak crowns a little release to keep them thriving.
Right. And normally in, 20, 30-year-old stand, we talk about releasing 50 oaks per acre. So if you go in early on in that first 10 years, you probably don't want to try to release every oak, but you want to, try to get maybe 50 to 100 oaks out there per acre and then manage those over time.
That'd be ambitious, wouldn't it? I'm going to release every oak.
It very well could be, but it might not be too. You might only have a few out there. So It depends on what you've got.
How about epicormic sprouting in oak when you release them through crop trees or as crop trees?
You get it, especially here in this part of the world in white oak. They are much more prone to have epicormic sprouts. You'll notice that those that have that tendency are probably going to show signs of it. So that probably should be one of the criteria when you're picking your crop trees. Those that don't have epicormics are going to be less likely to sprout. But and usually epicormics are some evidence that those trees were probably under stress to begin with. So ideally, if you've got those that don't have the sprouts, those are going to be the crop trees you pick. But it's just kind of unavoidable, especially in the white oaks. You're going to have some of that.
Okay. And here's a question. So there's a 25-acre clear cut in 2006 in Licking County. Is that in Ohio?
Yes, it is.
Okay, next to a neighbor's mature woods, oak woods. Some oaks came up after the clear cut. How can the owner of the 25-acre clear cut take advantage of the neighbor's trees, especially the acorns, to establish more oaks? So looks like he's going to be removing invasives, bushes, and vines. Should he also remove less desirable trees such as crab apples to allow sunlight for oak?
Well, I would again go back to what's on the ground. It's going to be hard to catch up. It's been 10 years after the cut. Was that right? 2006?
Yeah, right.
So planting something now that's a foot tall seedling to catch up with things that have a 10-year start is going to be tough. So I think the best strategy would be going out, finding the few oaks that you have and making sure that they have room to grow. So removing competitors around those trees, especially invasive competitors. But that would be my focus. But it's going to be hard to make recommendations without seeing the site to see how many oaks are out there per acre to actually manage.
Okay. Here's a question wanting to know if Ohio State Extension or anyone is available to help apply controlled burns on small areas of private land.
Currently, no. There are a few consulting foresters in our directory of foresters. The Society of American Foresters manages a directory of foresters, and it's osafdirectory.com. That's osafdirectory.com. And there are a couple in that group who offer prescribed fire, but it's not a common thing. You have to be a certified burn manager to actually conduct prescribed fire in Ohio. So there are very few folks out there with those credentials that do it on private land.
Okay. And I'm not even, I know it's regulated in New York, so I'm assuming in other states this isn't something you want to try on your own.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing not. So
in Ohio, we also have some periods where it's illegal to burn in the spring and the fall. So unless you have permits and so on, you can't legally do it. And you really need legally to have a prescribed fire manager on site. Too many things that can go wrong if you don't understand what you're doing. So definitely not recommend it at all.
Right. Okay. There have been a couple of questions about how forecasts or predictions of climate change may influence oak regeneration in the future.
Good question. We actually approached, or we addressed that a little bit at one of our workshops last year. And if you look at most of the climate change models, oak is going to do fairly well. As the climate warms and dries, oak is actually predicted to do pretty well. I still think no matter what the scenario, the light is the driving factor. So there's still going to be obstacles to regen, but if the climate warms as predicted and it dries as predicted, oaks would probably benefit. So, long term, there's just more justification to manage for your oaks.
Okay. Here's a question on scale of ownership. So what's the smallest acreage where you talked about controlling invasives and managing intermediate kind of structures of shade. Of the things that you mentioned, those treatments, what's the smallest acreage where you might be able to effectively manage to support oak regen?
I mean, I think you could do it on a relatively small scale, but for the most part, our services from DNR's Division of Forestry and from the consulting world probably don't kick in for most people unless you have at least 10 acres. But certainly, oak would regenerate on a much smaller scale than that. So the advantage of a small scale is that you have a lot less area to treat. So I think it's possible to have an impact even on a very small acreage, even a couple acres. But there's efficiencies with scale, and costs start coming down as the scale increases. And obviously with fire, getting down to an acre or two wouldn't be a possibility.
Okay. Similarly, on smaller scale, there's a question about the it's worded. I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. So, in a small scale situation, are there circumstances that would encourage the planting of native shrubs or perennials amongst the 4 to 5 foot oak seedlings? Are you? So I'm not. So there's maybe if it's hard. I can't see all the questions at once. So maybe there's been clarification of that later on. But I'll just read it. In a small scale situation, does it make sense to plant any native shrubs or perennials along with the 4 to 5 foot tall oak seedlings?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have much experience with that. What the best timing would be to actually plant those native shrubs and perennials, but my guess would be to wait a bit until you at least get some canopy closure. If they're shrubs and perennials that are typically under an oak forest, they're probably going to be under some shade. So my guess is it might be a little early to start planting those. So I would almost wait till after the canopy closes and you get some shade on the forest floor. So you're probably talking at year 10 to 15 or later would be my gut. I don't have any real research to base that on. That's just a kind of a gut feeling.
Okay. This may be from the same person that had the 25-acre clear-cut, 2 old giant solitary oaks that remain in a pine forest. Assuming looks like a pine was planted in 1980, thinned in 2006. Should you clear out from around the oaks to encourage more oaks? I'm envisioning like some maybe super canopy oak with some white pine underneath, and then the goal is to encourage oak regeneration.
Yeah, and that's pretty common and that happened a lot in Ohio, and I'm sure in the East. Those are probably old trees that survived the heavy periods of grazing. It's probably an oak forest initially, but with severe and heavy long-term grazing, the numbers of trees declined and it became more of a park-like setting, similar to the photo I showed earlier in the presentation. And then over time, either in your part of the world, it might have been some natural regeneration of pine or a plantation, but it's certainly you could utilize or take advantage of that oak if it's still producing acorns. And that's the question: are those trees regular acorn producers? And really, the thing to do is start watching. Possibly remove some of that mid-story interfering vegetation initially, and then once you get a good cohort of oak seedlings starting to become established, then you need to start managing that light and eventually allowing more light to the forest floor, let them develop more, and then eventually release them. So as long as they're acorn producers, there is some hope to expand the footprint of that oak.
Okay. Here's a question. Do you recommend any particular, we may need some clarification on this from Scott. Do you recommend any particular plantings, I'm not sure of what, that are beneficial to oaks to facilitate their establishment? So maybe, I don't know, is that like nurse crops? Or you mentioned, allowing old fields to come back to pine, which are then subsequently regenerated to oak? Are there other things you can do maybe at the time that oaks are, you're trying to get acorns established, other things to be planting, cover crops or nurse crops or anything like that?
Nothing I can think of. I'm afraid that would just add too much time, into the equation to make it very practical. One thing I didn't mention, and one thing that's hitting Ohio now, is emerald ash borer. And we've got stands that don't have a lot of oak in them that may be dominated more by ash and other species. So one thing I didn't mention, you can supplemental plant under other species as well, but it's a little bit more difficult than allowing on the natural regeneration, and your percentage of seedlings that make it are probably relatively low, but it's certainly possible to underplant oak seedlings in those settings. But again, it's still, oak seedlings need that intermediate light at least. So it would take light management to make that successful, but you would follow a similar prescription and plant supplemental plant under some of these other canopies, especially when you have some mortality from emerald ash borer and so on. But again, once that canopy of ash is gone, you're going to get this flush of vegetation that very well may outcompete the oak. So it's going to take some work to keep that balance.
Mm-hmm. And so that segues nicely into a question: is there a time of year when you're trying to control these undesirable species? Is there a time of year that's best to apply treatments?
It's going to be species specific as to when to do the treatments. But if we're talking about woody invasive plants, then the timing typically would be, the best time that we've seen with most of our treatments is late summer to early fall. We like to get these herbicide treatments in these trees, these systemic herbicides, so that when the trees start to shut down for the winter and start transporting their food reserves into the root systems, if they're carrying the herbicides down with them. So most of the labels will say you can treat almost any time of year, with a few exceptions and depending on the treatment. But usually when it comes to woody invasives, that fall, late summer, early fall treatment period seems to be what most of our folks recommend.
And I'm guessing, that I've seen that as well. Some of it, of course, depends upon, as you say, it's very species specific, and then also it's treatment specific. Whether you're doing a foliar treatment or an injection,
absolutely,
hack and squirt or cut stump or basal bark or whatever. So there's a lot of permutations to consider.
And thanks for pointing that out, because we don't do many foliar treatments around here. So obviously, you have to have green foliage that's actively growing.
That makes it work so much better when they're.
It does.
So, well, Dave, I think I'm not seeing any new questions. Lots of people chimed in that they thought that you did a great job, and I second that. I want to thank all of the participants, and especially thank Dave for putting together a very good presentation. For those of you that want to see it again, you can come back and see it at 7 o'clock tonight. Dave will be back again live, and we'll talk more about oak regeneration. So until then, thank you all. Thank you, Dave, and I'll see you about 6:50 tonight.
Sounds good. Thanks, Pete.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.